Do you like the Brady Bunch? I did. Or at least I did when I was a kid when I used to watch it in reruns on cable. It wasn't until years later I found out when the show was initially on it wasn't that big of a hit. Now, don't get me wrong, with context to how many channels there were back then, people watched it, but it wasn't until years later that it became this just pop culture phenomenon. Like, everyone's obsessed with the Brady Bunch. I think more people watched it in the 80s than they did when it was initially on. It's pretty crazy to think about, and it's lasted. Through Nick at Night and probably memes today, we all seem to connect with the Bradys. My thing with that was always this, I don't know, focus of morality. The Brady Bunch was always just about the kids learning these little lessons every episode, and the parents kind of teaching them those lessons. It had a simple format, and within that you could just tap into suburbia and the zeitgeist in America and all of us growing up somewhat. Now, most likely white kids related to that family a little bit more, but not all of us grew up in a family with so many children. The great thing about the Brady Bunch, though, is that I think not only is there lessons there for children, it's a lesson in communication and families having to work together. The brothers having to talk to the sisters and the parents. And even though everyone's got their own schemes and motivations for why they do what they do, ultimately a family has to learn how to work things out together so you can progress and learn to live together because it's a bunch of people in a house. And as all of us have went through it, you know that can be stressful or enjoyable just based off what you make out of it. So, this is my series Underrated Classics, where I talk about films that I think have been underappreciated and deserve a reevaluation years later. Today we're going to be talking about the Brady Bunch movie, which is not a movie of the show necessarily. They did do TV movies later. I believe they did one, I think Bobby was like a race car driver. I believe I saw that when I was a kid, and I think there was a Christmas one, which is pretty crazy. But I'm talking about the Betty Thomas film from the mid-90s. And if you don't know who she is, she directed the Howard Stern film Private Parts. I'm actually a big fan of hers, and I wish that she had had a better career, but she kind of peaked in the 90s and then has just been doing kind of crappy family films and stuff like that over the last few years. Now, to this film's credit, it didn't get bad reviews. It has 64% on Rotten Tomatoes, and it actually made money. The film cost $12 million to make, and it made $54 million worldwide. Now, that's not huge money, but it did really well, and you didn't have to have a movie make $100 million even back in the 90s for it to be a pretty successful comedy. You know, if you could make a decent profit, then you could rely on home video and television. And this film killed on home video. So when I say underrated, I understand that a lot of people have seen this movie, and it did make its money back, and it did get decent reviews. So it wasn't a failure. Really a failure at all. It did really well. So it's for some people, they might go, why are you saying it's underrated? It exceeded expectations. Well, I think it's underrated because I think it's a comedy classic. I think it's a modern comedy classic, and I would even argue that the sequel, a very Brady sequel, is an even better movie and even funnier. So it's crazy, there's two movies. How often is there a good comedy film and then a sequel that's just as good? That's really rare in that genre. Outside of, the Pink Panther movies and that kind of stuff. But really, 80s comedies, a lot of the great ones like Caddyshack and Ghostbusters, had pretty disappointing sequels. This movie and Bill and Ted, Bogus Journey, which is another great sequel that I might talk about later, really show that you can take the foundation of the original film and the characters and then put them in a new situation or introduce something new that changes the dynamics. Everything that's funny about the first movie is funny in the second movie, but adding this villain character, this antagonist character, and really making it a movie in itself that he's just like, oh my god, because the first film, if you don't know what the gimmick of it is, it's taking the Bradys of the 70s and putting them in the cynical 90s. So all of the characters, all of the actors are playing it like they're in the 70s. The father, the mother, the kids, the house looks like the 70s. Everything about their house is like the original Brady Bunch. But everyone else around them is in the 90s and modern, and it's like, what the hell is wrong with these people? Are you crazy? This was a masterstroke of a premise to make a modern-day Brady Bunch movie. Instead of making the movie a period piece, they said, no, let's keep the ridiculous nature of these people and put them in something that would be funny. This is what they should have done with the Scooby-Doo movie, and I believe James Gunn's original script was more like this. You take the Scooby-Doo gang of the old 60s show and throw them in a real horror movie, and then just hilarity ensues. It's just a great way. It's a meta twist on something that you really can't adapt in a literal way. Now, what I also like about this movie is that it's a nice homage to the original series. This is the perfect kind of parody in the way that they don't just insult the material. The people who made this movie don't hate the Brady Bunch. They clearly love the Brady Bunch, but they understand there's a lot of stuff there to make fun of. So while they make fun of it, they also show you through very subtle work, I think from a directing standpoint, there's kind of this detached single tone the whole movie kind of has. And I think it was the right move to play. If they would have gotten a little bit more aggressive and, maybe like Wayne's World, a little bit more color and pop and style, the movie may have been better. But I think that you get to enjoy the performances more and the comedy, and it makes the movie work a little bit better because the director doesn't add too much of a presence. I think that's why Private Parts work too, is that you just kind of got to see Howard Stern and Robin and them act out these radio scenes and Paul Giamatti coming in. It was really funny. Betty Thomas is a director of great restraint, and I think this movie is a testament to that. And I think she could have developed this into a style that would have led to some really, just really funny movies. I think she had a lot of great films ahead of her, and she just didn't get enough work. Let's talk about the performances, though, real quick. A big reason this film works, and the thing that it was initially praised for when it came out, was the casting. Shelley Long is terrific as Carol Brady. Gary Cole is just as good as the dad. Who Alice is terrific. And one of my favorite actors out there who's had a very crappy career, Christopher Daniel Barnes, and he was Greg Brady. If you don't know who he is, some 90s kids out there, he was the voice of Spider-Man in the Fox Kids Spider-Man cartoon. He's honestly maybe my favorite Peter Parker, and I think he's underappreciated. Like, he should be up there with Mark Hamill's Joker or Kevin Conroy's Batman. He did a great Peter Parker, and he's got a great voice, and that's mostly what he's been doing is voice acting, but he was a great actor. He's really good in this movie. He kills it as Greg Brady, and Christine Taylor, Ben Stiller's wife now, as Marcia Brady. She looks like a hotter version of Marcia Brady. She's a better looking version of the original actress. Those two in particular are so well cast, and the director and the writers are smart enough to focus enough of it on Greg and Marcia, and because they kind of could tell these two really have the charisma, and both movies play that up, and they're just terrific. I mean, they have great chemistry. The way that they play with because the actors in real life were actually hooking up. They play off that in the sequel movie that, oh, we're not related, so we could actually get together if we wanted. But I just love seeing the Bradys in the 90s, where we were all into, like, grunge and wearing clothes that were way too big. And honestly, now looking back at this movie, it works as a period piece for the 90s. Instead of you thinking how ridiculous the Bradys are, you're watching some of this realizing how ridiculous the 90s was. Which is pretty funny, actually, now. It kind of ages well. It's got this timeless quality about it, though, because they stay so true to the Brady Bunch mentality and format, and yet because they break out enough, it also works as a film that is a time capsule of the 90s and culture. And it's that clashing of cultures that makes it a really unique film. And really a comedy that I hadn't seen much like it before. A lot of movies that try to do TV shows adapted into a new movie, like Car 54, Where Are You?, are terrible movies. I mean, most of them are really bad. Recently, 21 Jump Street did pretty well, but I think this film did it years before. And I think it came down to, like, amazing casting. I think these actors are probably better actors in a lot of ways than the actors in the original show. Who I'm a big fan of all of them, but they're almost maybe better, so they can play these parts with this self-awareness that almost makes it more engrossing in parts. I don't know. I always really liked this movie. I loved it when I was a kid. I watched it for years. My family loved it. We rented it all the time. And I thought just everyone loved this movie. I thought it was famous and acclaimed. And then it wasn't until years later I found out that, like, it doesn't have that many votes on IMDb. People don't really talk about it much. I never hear it brought up in any comedy list. I mean, it's really not a film that's talked about that much. It was popular at the time, and if you grew up then, you remember it. But the newer generation isn't familiar with the Brady Bunch movie. Maybe they don't even really care about the Brady Bunch anymore because, young people aren't even watching Nick at Night like we kind of did in the 90s. That stuff's kind of dying off, watching the old retro television shows. Because you have Netflix and stuff now. But I think if people went back and looked at this, they would find a very well-made, funny, nice movie. And there's really not much to go into your subtext, thematic depth. It's not a deep movie. It's not going to challenge you intellectually. But it will make you laugh. And it'll make you feel good. And there's just something that it's always on the cusp of becoming like an R-rated movie or getting into these really screwed up situations. The fact that it avoids all that I know Roger Ebert didn't like that about it. He thought it should have been like an R-rated movie with the Bradys, and I get what he means, and I think they would do that today. But I like that the movie tries to keep the sweetness, that earnest nature of the Brady Bunch, so it doesn't betray it. In that way, it's that's why it's a perfect parody, and that's why I think it's one of the better comedies in the '90s. I think it's aged wonderfully, and it's upsetting that a lot of these actors didn't have better careers. Obviously Shelley Long didn't need help, and Christine Taylor's had a pretty good career. But even how they use the Brady music at the end of the film and do the talent show, terrific. And the second film has one of the funniest bits I've ever seen is when a character is on mushrooms, eating spaghetti, and he has a trip out sequence when he's hanging out with the Bradys at the dinner table, and Alice's character eats the mushrooms too, and she's like, I don't know, I feel perfectly fine, and then she opens the door to the fridge and walks in the refrigerator. I laugh so hard every time, and there's too many classic gags. Christine Taylor's hotter in this than she ever was ever. She's amazing in it. They made a third movie, The Brady Bunch in the White House. That one sucks. I wouldn't recommend that movie. But if you can get a DVD double feature of these, or if you can just get the first movie, it comes on cable sometimes, check this out if you haven't seen it. And if you think you didn't like it before, I think go look at it again. This is a... when I say a classic, I don't mean it's like a classic, like this is one of the great films of all time. I think it's a classic comedy. It's a classic 90s comedy that deserves some respect, and it should be showing up a lot more. And that's all I got, people. So like, comment, and subscribe. Please rewind your VHS tapes.